This video is on Samuel Johnson, perhaps the most important figure in 18th century literature, except perhaps for Alexander Pope. Samuel Johnson was a poet and a scholar, and the kinds of projects that he was involved in are various and would have an enormous impact on the history of English literature and the English language itself. So he was born in 1709 in a country town of Lichfield in Staffordshire, the son of a bookseller and stationer. He would refer to this town in later poems. He often mentions the River Trent, in later poems. He had a kind of fondness for his childhood home, and contrasts the country life of Lichfield with the urban life of London. He suffered from a terrible illness in his youth, scrofula, which impaired his eyesight and hearing for life. There are portraits of him, holding books right up to his eyes because he could barely see the print, and left his neck and face very severely disfigured. Terrible disease. Terrible disease. From 1726 to 29, he's working in his father's failing bookshop. He enters Pembroke College, Oxford, studies there, but poverty and depression interfere with his studies, and he would battle this depression for his entire life. And he wound up leaving Oxford without taking a degree. During this period, Samuel Richardson is opening his own publishing venture. And later, Richardson would support Johnson. In 1735, he marries a woman named Elizabeth Porter, whose dowry helped him to establish a private boarding school near Lichfield. And one of his pupils is David Garrick, who would later become the most famous stage actor of the period, and he would run the very famous Drury Lane theater for decades. He was the most famous stage actor of the 18th century, particularly known early on for his portrayal of Shakespeare's Richard III, a very challenging role. In 1737, the boarding school fails, and Johnson leaves Lichfield for London to begin his career as a professional writer, and he's accompanied by David Garrick, who becomes a wine merchant for a while in London before embarking on his career in the theater in the 1740s. 1738, he's living in poverty in London. He contributes journalism to the Gentleman's Magazine, and he befriends Richard Savage, another impoverished poet, very, very poor, of dubious reputation. In the 1720s, he murdered a man, and he lived very much hand to mouth, and he and Samuel Johnson would roam the streets of London late at night together. Just interesting. In 1744, after Savage died in jail, Samuel Johnson wrote his biography of Richard Savage, and this was a sort of a new genre that Johnson pioneered, the literary biography. And this was quite popular. He would end his career writing biographies of writers too, as you'll see. 1748, he begins his work on the Dictionary of the English Language, which was finally issued in 1755. And this was a monumental development in the history of the English language. He standardized. This is the beginning of the standardization of spelling and the definitions of the words. For his definitions, he used literary texts, works of literature, to supply the definitions. So it was a very scholarly work as well, and went through numerous editions in Johnson's lifetime. From 1750 to 52, he publishes another genre that he was very deft in, the periodical essays, in a weekly journal called The Rambler. 1756, he begins editing a new edition of Shakespeare, which would finally appear in 1765. This is a very important edition of Shakespeare, which corrected a lot of the errors of earlier editors. I would say it's the first, the first really scholarly edition of Shakespeare, although it would eventually be supplanted by later efforts of later scholars. He's also arrested for debt this year and is bailed by Samuel Richardson. He begins another series of periodical essays in the late 1750s, this time called The Idler. The first group was called The Rambler. This group is called The Idler. His mother died in 1759, and he published a romance. He called it a philosophical romance called Rasselas, and he did this very quickly, reportedly. I mean, according to Johnson, he did this to pay for his mother's funeral expenses. But Rasselas is still in print today and continues to be read. That's a close-up of Sir Joshua Reynolds' portrait of Richardson, but that portrait there is by another British painter named John Oppie. 1762, George III becomes king and provides Johnson with an annual pension that maintains him for the rest of his life. This is owing in large part to his fame for the Dictionary of the English Language. In 1763-64, he befriends a much younger man named James Boswell, who becomes his future biographer. And he forms, with Boswell, an influential group called the Club, and other members of this organization. This club would be Edmund Burke, David Garrick, of course, his friend Boswell, and the painter Joshua Reynolds, who was the inaugural president of the Royal Academy of Art in England. There's a picture of Boswell. I'm going to show you a picture of the club meeting here. So, because we're going to encounter so many of these people, I think it would be a good idea to use this picture of one of the meetings of the club to identify them. There's Samuel Johnson seated there, and to his right, with the ear horn held to his ear, is the painter Joshua Reynolds, whose paintings are also hanging on the wall there. There's David Garrick, the actor. Here's James Boswell, whom I've already mentioned. Here's an interesting character, Charles Burney. We're not going to read anything by Charles Burney. He was a musician and a music historian. But his daughter, Frances Burney, became a novelist, and we're going to read one of her novels later in the semester. And she also attended on Samuel Johnson near the end of his life. And Thomas Warton and Oliver Goldsmith, both of them poets. Thomas Warton was poet laureate for a time. And we'll read their poems later in the semester. And back to the timeline. From 1773 to 75, he travels to Scotland, Wales, and France, and publishes yet another popular genre, the travelogue, called A Journey to the Western Isles of Scotland. and also at this time is publishing pamphlets opposing the American independence movement, which would, of course, lead to war a few years later. 1779 to 81, there's a big publishing project to publish the works of all the great English poets, and Johnson was asked to supply biographies of these poets. The project was never completed, but Johnson did finish all of the biographies, and they wound up being published separately in a series of, I think 3 or 4. Let me look on my bookshelf here. 4. I've got 4 volumes of biographies of English poets. And this was one of the last things he did. His health declines, and he suffered a stroke and died in 1784 and was buried in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. So we're looking at 2 poems. London, which was published in 1738. There's the title page to the first edition. And notice that Juvenal is mentioned on the title page there, the third satire of Juvenal, in imitation of the third satire of Juvenal. And then The Vanity of Human Wishes, which is an imitation of the 10th satire. So both imitations of the Latin satirist Juvenal, who wrote really scathing poems against Roman decadence, and I talk about Juvenalian satire in another video. The speaker in the poem London, starting at line 35, is a character named Thales, believed by some scholars to be Johnson's friend, the poet Richard Savage. And Thales excoriates the venality of British statesmen, the negative influence of French culture, and in particular French actors who had immigrated to England. And he talks a lot about urban crime. And I give you a passage from the beginning of the poem where he talks about these things. Here, malice, rapine, accident conspire, and now a rabble rages, now a fire. Their ambush here relentless ruffians lay, and here the fell attorney prowls for prey. But he's especially sympathetic to the plight of the poor, who are often ridiculed by the wealthy. A large section of the poem is devoted to that topic. The Vanity of Human Wishes satirizes the folly that comes with the accumulation of wealth and beauty, political power, martial prowess, scholarly achievement, the wish for a long life, all the things that people hope for and strive for. And Johnson points out how all of these things produce anxiety, unhappiness, humiliation, and sometimes sickness and death. And I think this passage from the very beginning, lines 5 through 10 of the poem, say that concisely. Then say how hope and fear, desire and hate overspread with snares the clouded maze of fate, where wavering man, betrayed by venturous pride, to tread the dreary paths without a guide, as treacherous phantoms in the mist delude, shuns fancied ills or chases airy good. So some questions for discussion. Where does Thales speak of the plight of the poor in the poem London, and what connection does he draw between poverty and crime? Where does he contrast Britain's glorious past? This is something that Pope also had done in Windsor Forest. Where does he contrast Britain's glorious past with the corruption of contemporary London? And where does he say refuge is still to be found? Identify the follies of wealth, beauty, political power, martial prowess, scholarly achievement, and longevity in the Vanity of Human Wishes. And of these, which argument do you find most compelling or true? And finally, given the futility of our hopes and fears and the general expectation of unhappiness in life, what consolation does Johnson offer at the end of the poem? Do you find it satisfying? Why or why not? I'll be curious to see how you respond to these in class. And that concludes this video on Samuel Johnson.